everyone. My name is Megan Grifford. I am an assistant professor in here in the College of Education. This afternoon, what we'll be speaking about is remote versus hybrid. How did pandemic era learning environments shape outcomes? So we'll be here for about an hour. Um, okay. So just to give you a sense of what we'll be doing today, first I'll do a brief introduction overview of the objectives that we're covering today. Next, I'll sort of give some background and framing based in the research about pandemic era learning environments and the many factors that went into how local government officials and educational leaders and policymakers arrived at the decisions that they did about what type of schooling to offer during the peak of the pandemic. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about school climate, which is where teaching and learning take place, and the strong relationship between the type of school climate that's facilitated and the academic outcomes that we observe. Next, I will talk a little bit about the main study. So most of the research I am going to share today comes from a single study that involved speaking with school social workers, school psychologists, and school guidance counselors who were working in either a hybrid, so partially in-person, partially remote schooling environment, or a fully remote schooling environment. And what they, as experts on the people in their buildings, saw was happening with school climate during the pandemic. Some findings and recommendations based on what we learned from our participants. And the reason that this is important is because a lot of public health research is indicating that we may see more pandemics in the future. There's a variety of reasons for that, with global climate change and just increased globalization between people all over the world, and travel, and just the way that we interact, and the spread of germs. I'm not an expert in public health, so I'm going to try to avoid talking too deeply about that. Then we'll have some time for some Q&A, and then we'll wrap up at 1 o'clock. I know that the teachers that are joining us today have an in-service day, and so thank you for choosing to spend some of your time with us here at UNLV and the College of Ed. So to begin with, our objectives for today is just to understand the importance of school climate for teaching and learning, analyze the various factors that informed how educational leaders and policymakers made decisions about school environments during the pandemic, and then understand how school climate shifted under remote and hybrid learning environments during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so sort of the goal of this research is just to give people as much information as I can about what we learned about school climate during the pandemic, so that in the event that we encounter the pandemic or other disruptions to schooling, like, for example, we could think about what's happening in LA right now and how to support students who can't physically be in school. And so that's the goal of this study. As I said, I'm Megan Grifford. I'm an assistant professor of educational policy and leadership. My research mostly focuses on two things. So the one that I'll be focusing on today is disruptions to schooling, which includes things like climate disasters, pandemics, and student hospitalization. So when students are hospitalized for an extended period of time, just an individual student, what that's like and how we can support those kids. And then the other thing that I study sometimes is school finance. And the fun fact I have about that is one time I was an expert witness in a legal proceeding about school finance for the State Public Charter School Authority. Other things to know about me: I am a former CCSD teacher. I taught at Mojave High School. I am also an alum of the UNLV College of Ed. I received my master's in curriculum and instruction in 2014. I am a mom and a wife, and I am a lover of Aces basketball, Taylor Swift, and Ted Lasso. One of the pictures there up on the screen is me and Jason Sudeikis at an Aces New York Liberty playoff game. So that was very exciting. Okay, so to dive right into our content for today, I'm going to start with just talking about pandemic era learning environments, the politics, policies, and pressures. I was debating whether to add also, as to keep with this alliteration of P, pupils and parents. So what did people want to see happen when we were in the middle of the pandemic? So as you're probably aware, during the peak of the pandemic, most schools operated in one of two ways. So there were fully remote schools, which were only virtual spaces. There was no face-to-face for students. And then there were hybrid schools, which combined remote instruction with face-to-face learning. And so most often what we found happens with hybrid schools is that it was a smaller subset of students would come in on specific days. The other kids would be online working either via Zoom or doing something asynchronous. And then those groups would rotate through. And it was obviously for students with family needs or health concerns, they could remain fully remote if that was something that was preferential for them. And then, of course, we also observed, which we'll talk about with attendance, that there were some students that for months on end during the pandemic, schools did not see or hear from them or their families, which is very problematic when we think about the continuity of learning and services that students receive in school. So one thing we found just across the US and across the world is that the guidance from state educational agencies and even from the federal government about what type of learning environment schools should use during the pandemic was very fragmented and piecemeal. So what that meant is the majority of the control and the decision making was left up to the county governments, local public health officials, school district leaders. And we're talking about an unprecedented time where there's not really like a playbook that exists that tells people, okay, like if there's this many people in your hospitals, if there's this many people intubated, if there's this many people who are testing positive out in your community, like this is when you should go hybrid, this is when you should do remote. There's no hard and fast rule that has been established. And so people making these decisions had a variety of things influencing them, including health, population density, demographics, socioeconomics, teachers unions, and then just politics in general, political party affiliation. I'm sure we could see there's a breakdown in terms of what types of schooling were offered based on the presiding beliefs of political parties that dominate different spaces. So one consideration that was always at the forefront or should have always been at the forefront of policymakers' minds is student needs. So what we know, and I'm sure the teachers that are on the call with us today can attest to, is that the academic consequences of the pandemic are still something that we're dealing with today. And some researchers estimated that having a 3-month school closure, so if we're talking about maybe like that March to the end of the school year in 2020, that can be the equivalent of a full year of learning loss for a student. And then we also know, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, that learning loss is often greater for students from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds and from students whose families' education is less of a priority for them. And that's not because, that's not to suggest that those families don't care. It's just, sometimes other more pressing needs like putting food on the table or working or taking care of children takes precedence over academics. Another thing we saw is that as the pandemic went on, and if you think about in the lifetime of a kid, a 10-year-old, if they're not in school in the way that we think of being in school typically for an entire year, that's 10% of their life. That's 50% of their schooling experience because you start school typically around age 5. And so as the pandemic went on, there were a lot of students who reported feeling that they had a lot of increased academic pressure. They were very frustrated with their teachers. They were not happy with their schools. They felt alienated and isolated from their schools. Another thing to keep in mind is, like I mentioned, the pandemic we're still feeling the effects of that in K-12 schooling. And researchers expect that dropout rates are just going to continue to go up. And educational attainment, so high school graduation, college graduation, graduate degrees, all of that is going to fall in the next couple of years. Another thing that I know, especially here in Southern Nevada, that we are still really struggling with is the fact that attendance is super, super important for student learning. You have to be in school, whatever that looks like, whether it's on your computer or in the physical school building. You have to be in school to learn what you need to learn in school. And students often attendance decreased significantly for students, especially low-income students, especially students who had other responsibilities at home, like taking care of siblings, taking care of elderly parents or grandparents. And then even when school districts and states modified their attendance policies to be more flexible to sort of accommodate the fact that, a student may not be able to sit in front of their computer from 9 to 3 because they have to take care of younger siblings while a parent is at work, even making things more flexible, that was not enough to solve the problem and close the gap of students who were not coming to school. And we're still seeing the effects of that today, as I'm sure you know. Um, Another thing is that the pandemic was an emotional and very difficult time for, I think, for all of us, but especially if you're a young person. Adolescents didn't have opportunities to connect with peers and adults outside of their homes. There are a lot of new stressors and social emotional issues that arose for children. I think that some teachers, maybe some of those on the call, have experienced the fact that there are lingering behavioral and emotional issues that students are dealing with that's really hit their peak during the pandemic. Students also had things like family members' health, food and housing insecurity. We know that unemployment and the need for food and housing assistance increased during the pandemic. And then another thing to know is that social distancing and isolation can also increase suicidal ideation and suicide risk in adolescents. And so one thing that was reported is that between April and October of 2020, there were 31% more hospital visits for adolescents for mental health services than there had been in the same time period the year before. And that's just because the pandemic was a very stressful and isolating time, and sometimes students manifested that in behaviors that put them in danger. As we know, schools are more than just books and learning. There is a lot of services and needs that get met by for students by schools. And so there are needed resources that students didn't get. The majority of students who receive some sort of mental health care actually receive it in their schools. More than half of school-age children are dependent on schools for their meals. And there was not a lot of guidance from states about how do you make sure that your students that have a mental health need or need to be fed, how do you get those services to those children? And so one thing that emerged was this idea of the hybrid school. So you can come to school some days, you'll get your services when you're there. It can minimize some of the risks of COVID-19, but would still give students the opportunity to socialize, to get what they need from their teachers and the other supports professionals at schools. Another thing to keep in mind is educator preferences influenced the way that schools and school districts decided to reopen, whether it was going to be remote or hybrid. And the reason for that is as Department of Labor statistics can tell us, the teaching labor workforce is an aging population, and we know that with age, what happens is there's often increased health concerns and health needs. And so there were a lot of teachers who genuinely felt unsafe returning to school and putting their health at risk. And so what we saw is that there were a lot of school districts across the US that introduced ways to provide more flexibility and an appropriate workload balance for teachers. Teachers still nevertheless struggled during the pandemic. It was an extremely Herculean task, as one of our participants that I'll share in a little bit said, to have to go through teaching in a completely new context and supporting students in a completely new context, and one that maybe the students themselves are not fully engaged with or fully comfortable with. Teachers reported a lot of stress over health and safety about possibly returning to fully in-person schooling. And I think we can still see that today. With teacher stress, it was the workload of not only having to teach, but having to look after students in this new online space. And then making sure there was still the academic pressure to make sure students are still learning during the pandemic, even though we for the most part, suspended testing requirements and had these flexible attendance policies. The expectation, as soon as schools went back to fully in person, was that students would be performing at the levels that they were previously. And that's something that's very difficult to attain when you're doing something completely different for a large chunk of time in there. And then teachers are most comfortable, what research has shown us, teaching face-to-face. There are obviously teachers who excel in teaching in fully virtual environments, but the majority of teachers prefer teaching face-to-face when possible, when safe, when healthy, when appropriate. And then there's just politics and public health. So local partisanship and then union strength greatly influenced reopening decisions. More so, researchers suggest that these had greater influence than COVID-19 case numbers. So what one set of political scientists found is that Republicans preferred reopening fully in person, more so than in places where Democrats had a stronghold. And then some other researchers suggest that people were still taking those COVID case numbers into account when they were making these decisions. But again, there was no playbook in place to tell a local government public health department or a county school district what to do. And so the existing emergency plans did not foresee this massive COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the hopes is that now that we've gone through this one time, we're perhaps a little bit more prepared in the event that we do encounter those pandemics in the future. Lastly, there was also parents. So suddenly parents became teachers in the home, as well as probably many had to keep up with their own employment, taking care of younger children, taking care of elderly, aging adults and parents, and all of those responsibilities. And what researchers found is there were subsets of parents who strongly preferred in-person teaching, and that included more affluent families that could accommodate schools being open, could accommodate their work and childcare demands. Some parents did express more concern about viral transmission rates in their areas. But as a whole, what we saw is that parents, regardless of their preferences about remote or hybrid or in-person schooling, is that the stress of dealing with the pandemic and dealing with their children increased significantly in this time period of the height of the pandemic. And then lastly, of course, we're talking about a pandemic, we're talking about the illness that's going around. And so there were very few school districts in fall 2020 that reopened fully face-to-face. It was less than 25% across the country. And if we think about really small rural school districts composing a large proportion of that 25%, and then our bigger urban areas and our suburban areas sticking to the remote or hybrid. And there were a lot of schools that opted for it to remain when schools reopened in fall 2020. A lot of schools that opted to remain fully remote. And so this hybrid option emerged as sort of what researchers called a mid-risk option. So it would be your school is open at a reduced capacity. However, what researchers found is that transmission rates were the lowest in fully remote environments, and hybrid models had higher growth rates of coronavirus transmission than even fully in-person learning environments. And that was consistent across different types of school districts, accounting for school district relative poverty and population density. And then when schools, another set of researchers found that counties in Michigan and Washington that reopened fully in person or with hybrid had these very sharp increases in case rates after reopening. And so this kind of is this idea that the hybrid learning environment had a lot of potential, but maybe the first introductions of people to each other and just the difficulty of contact tracing and all of those things made it really difficult to keep the virus under control. So next we're going to jump into talking about school climate. So school climate is the physical, social, and emotional facets of the learning environment as perceived primarily by students and staff. So physical is, the building itself or the computers by which students and teachers are accessing the school environment. The social is the relationships that happen at school, and as we know, socialization is such an important part of the school experience. And then the emotional component is individuals' well-being, which includes things like happiness and self-efficacy. And school climate is extremely important. As anyone who's ever worked in a school building can tell you, the school climate is extremely predictive of teacher satisfaction and student performance. And so it can explain a lot of the net differences in academic outcomes between schools of similar demographic and social composition. So what that means is schools that are of maybe like serve a lower socioeconomic status student population, those that have really focused on fostering a positive school climate for their children and their teachers tend to perform better than a school that has the exact same demographics. That's, it could literally be right down the street from each other, and the performance outcomes that we see in that school are lower because school climate is not something that is prioritized in that building. And then school climate is extremely important for students who are coming from some sort of marginalized or disadvantaged background, and students who have those struggles in their personal lives come to school. If the school has a positive school climate, what we observe is that they perform better again than those students at another school that doesn't have that same kind of climate support in place. And there's just a lot of really interesting research on all of the things that positive school climate can do, including higher performance on testing, higher graduation and college going rates, lower rates of exclusionary discipline, and then also lower rates of chronic absenteeism, which are all things that I know we're thinking about after the pandemic anyway. And so school climate is one way that we can start to think about how can we improve those outcomes for kids. And it, again, can explain a lot of the net differences between different students in different types of schooling environments. And then it also is really good for students' emotional and social needs as well. Positive school climate is great for teachers and staff. Nobody wants to go to school, wants to go to work at a place where they don't feel good and have positive interactions with colleagues and with students and with supervisors. And so that's something that we see at schools with positive school climate is that teachers stay there longer, they report better working conditions, they report greater job satisfaction. And then students and teachers who positively perceive their school climate also report greater feelings of self-efficacy. And so what self-efficacy is that idea of when confronted with a challenge that you leverage the intrinsic and learned skills and knowledge that you possess as an individual to be able to accomplish a difficult task. In a school climate that's more positive, when students don't or teachers don't experience those feelings of self-efficacy, a positive school climate can help build up that learned skill of self-efficacy within students and teachers. And then one of the reasons that explains why school climate is so important for student learning is this idea of a psychological identification with the school. And that's just generally feeling an attachment to your school, a sense of school pride, a sense of wanting to go to school to see your friends, to see your teachers. And school climates that are positive school climates, one of the things that they always consistently do, as we've seen in the research, is that students and teachers work well together, they collaborate, and then teachers have high expectations and are consistently supportive of students. And that's just so important for helping students build those soft skills like self-efficacy for the future. Okay, so school climate during the pandemic. I think anybody that worked in a school during the pandemic or anybody that reads the news knows that it was a difficult and challenging time to be an educator or to be a student. And the positive perceptions that many educators and students felt about their schools often went down during the pandemic simply because of the added confounding stress of dealing with the pandemic and all of the rules and regulations and the remote and hybrid learning environment. Just adding in all of those extra factors into the process of being a part of a school made it a lot worse. And so one of the things that I want to talk about today is a lot of prior research that's looked into this has lumped remote and hybrid schools into one category and compared those outcomes to what happens in a fully in-person school. And our study looks at the differences between between remote and hybrid schools because we think that that's really useful for informing the way that we think about what to do in the event of a future pandemic or need for students to be out of school for an extended period of time. And so the focus of our study was looking at the perceptions and observations of school support professionals. So again, we're talking about those guidance counselors, social workers, and psychologists. And what researchers on these fields have said is basically the school climate and organizational health in the school is the job of these school support professionals. So throughout the rest of the presentation, I call them SSPs. And their job is focused on a positive school climate, which fosters student learning. And so they do that through academic supports, professional learning for teachers, mental, social, and emotional well-being for both teachers and staff. So SSPs support school climate by supporting students, and that's whether it has to do with academic achievement, behavior, absenteeism, etc. And they also play a role in when we have those diverse or potentially vulnerable or marginalized student populations, students of color, students who identify as gay and lesbian or transgender, and making sure that they have supports. Oops. Um, Another really big thing that I sort of touched on earlier was the idea that student mental health is primarily addressed and triaged in school settings. And so year over year, the number of students who report experiencing some kind of mental health crisis is continuing to go up. And this was before the pandemic, and we're seeing those numbers just continue to rise. And school-based counseling services can help really do make a difference in children's depression and anxiety. But more so, social workers, school counselors, and psychologists often coordinate and case manage the mental health services that students receive in the community. And this can, one of the things that's really important that some of my other research has focused on is often suicide prevention screenings are done in school, and school guidance counselors or social workers or whoever administers those surveys are the people who identify a student who may be in mental health crisis. 20% of all pediatric psychiatric emergency room visits originate as school-based referrals. So we're talking about 20% of students who are struggling with suicidal ideation or risk of suicidal behaviors are identified and given access to treatment from something that goes on in their school with a school support professional. School support professionals are also wonderful for teachers and for professionals they work with and other professionals in schools. So they work with principals and administrators. They also work with students and parents. And so they're really sort of this connective tissue that runs throughout the school to make sure that it's running healthy and that students and others are having their needs met. And so in their own words, school support professionals will tell you they're like professional cheerleaders that are really trying to make a difference in what's happening in schools to help students and staff be successful. School support professionals are likely to have the greatest knowledge and insights of school climate. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that people tell things to school support professionals often in confidence, or they're aware of things that are not information that's not available to the larger system. And so that's how they can have a more realistic picture of what's actually happening in a school in terms of its climate. And then the pandemic, because of all of the services and support that school support professionals provide, the pandemic only made them more important to schools. And they became even more aware of how students and staff were feeling during the pandemic than they actually had been previously. Okay, so jumping into the present study. So this was a qualitative paper, a research paper that drew data from a larger study that looked at school-based mental health services during the pandemic. And what we looked at here was in-depth interviews with school support professionals to talk about the similarities and differences between hybrid and remote learning environments on student and staff experiences in school. So students and staff are primarily the ones that are influenced by school climate. And so school support professionals, as experts on school climate, could tell us a lot about what they were seeing with the people that they worked with and interacted with. So this all came from a state in the Southwest that had 110 K-12 school districts. So they were municipality based as opposed to here where it's county based school school districts. And but some of the similarities between the southeastern state and here in Nevada is they have some very, very large pockets of urban and suburban areas. So like what we have with Clark County and Washoe, and then the rest of the state is very rural. It's a lot of agricultural families and things like that. And so we see there are some parallels, even though this is a state that's all the way on the other side of the country. And again, just like what we had everywhere else, is there was a lot of discretion at the local level for what you could do during the pandemic in terms of offering remote or hybrid schooling. And so the folks that we talked to, they used a combination of both. Some were remote and some were hybrid. So just some statistics about our population. The thing to know, it was generally pretty parallel with National Bureau of Labor statistics about the demographics of school counselors. So most everyone we talked to was identified as a woman and was white, and most were school counselors. And as you're probably aware, school counselors, of the three, social workers, counselors, and psychologists, are the most common and the most staffed in schools. And so I'm sure anybody working in those fields or familiar with those fields would tell you that they're all important and all understaffed in certain ways. I know it's very common for school psychologists and social workers to report to multiple school sites, but for the most part, guidance counselors tend to be stable at a single school site. So we talked to these folks in between December 2020 and March 2021 via Zoom. Obviously, we're in the height of the pandemic. We're not going to do anything to put ourselves or others at risk. So we did a semi-structured format. And so this is just, it's a type of research interview that we have a list of things we want to talk about, but it's very conversational. And so you're given the opportunity as the researcher to ask follow-up questions if someone says something really interesting. And yeah, it's a great way to learn about what's on people's minds about specific topics. I'm not going to go too much into the data analysis. All I will say is that we took a lot of steps to make sure that we were right about what we were observing across the data, and we were looking for consistent themes among our participants to see where there were similarities and where there were differences between remote and hybrid school environments. And so we did this in a couple of different ways. More than one person analyzed each interview. We also did at the end something where we literally counted how many people were sharing similar observations or were touching on the same theme. So, for example, one of the themes that emerged was this idea of students being more isolated than ever. And so we just literally counted how many people brought this up in their interview. And so that's how we analyze the data, but I'm super excited to jump into the findings. So I think this is, I can talk a little bit about this at the end. I was very surprised by what we found. And I was not expecting to sort of leave this research with the perspective that I have. So to start off with, the social components of school climate. That's the relationships among students themselves, so friends and peers, and then the relationships between students and school professionals, so the relationships they have with administrators, teachers, guidance counselors, etc. So as anybody working in school can probably tell you, it was really hard to have any kind of relationship with someone when you're not seeing them consistently face to face every day. Or when you're seeing them face to face every day, but you have to be 6 feet apart and you have a mask on. And so it's very difficult to read facial expressions. And sometimes it can be difficult to hear or understand someone's tone. If you're someone who's hearing impaired, it's also very difficult when someone's mouth is covered and you're kind of relying on lip reading to be able to interpret what they're saying. What we observed across remote and hybrid environments is that things were really similar. People were struggling no matter what. And what was surprising is that the hybrid learning environment, this idea of mitigating so many of the challenges that we see with not being able to be physically present in school, the school support professionals that we talked to said that those extra benefits of being in hybrid really weren't there. And so that was really surprising to me, as I expected it to be a little bit better in hybrid schools, just because you do get the opportunity to be face to face with people. But what the professionals in our interviews told us is that really wasn't true. So like I said, some of the things that we saw with relationships between students is it's really isolating, and it's hard to know if you're not seeing someone every day. It's hard to know if their mood is changing or their affect is changing. And a lot of the support professionals that we talked about how the way that they identify a student who may be in crisis is because their friends will come and say, like, hey, Dr. Grifford, like, I noticed that Joe seems really distant and sad and like not like himself, and he's been that way for a while. Like, maybe you could check on him. And that doesn't happen if your friends don't see you face to face every day. And then what we saw, what was really interesting, is that the hybrid participants told us that the social opportunities that we would imagine would be available in a hybrid environment weren't there because there were so many restrictions about, distancing. You're with the same group of kids on the days that you come in. And so what this one participant in this quote bubble told us is like, hopefully you like the kids that are in your room because you're spending the day with them. In the lunchroom, you go and you pick your food and you sit at the table. But that what happened in this particular instance is viral loads across the county increased. And so what used to be a little bit of free choice in the lunchroom went away, and you had to go back to you got your food, you went back to your desk and you ate at your desk 6 feet apart from everybody else. And so they said that those organic things that happen when students are able to socialize more freely just weren't there in the hybrid environment. Another thing we saw is that clubs and activities, it really, that was something that was left up to schools for the most part, with very limited guidance from state and local education agencies. And so sometimes students were really interested, but overall, what we really saw, especially for middle and high school students, is students would log on to Zoom. They would not have their cameras on. They would not have their microphones on. If they had a question, maybe they would type it in the chat. That's, presuming that they're actually sitting in front of the computer and paying attention to what's happening on screen as opposed to just logging in and walking away. And so it was really difficult for teachers to even facilitate authentic or organic opportunities for students to talk to each other, because I'm sure, as anybody who's been in a Zoom meeting before knows, there's constantly, you're talking over each other, someone's microphone isn't on, all of those tech things that interfere with the ability to talk more freely. Another thing that our professionals told us is that social media, not surprising to anyone that's worked with children, social media was not a great tool during the pandemic. There was a lot of comparison. There was a lot of feelings of struggling with self-esteem and things like that. And so what we saw from our participants is that it seemed great, but with all social media, people are only presenting them their best selves. And so it wasn't necessarily always true that students were doing as well as what we could see online. And then students who didn't feel like they were doing as well often struggled with their mental health. And so, like I said, talking to a bunch of black boxes all day does not sound super, super fun. And the school support professionals that we talked to talked in a lot of detail about, we just don't know where some of these kids are. Like, they don't log in, they don't answer their phone. We go to their house and, the phone number, or they go to the house, no one answers the door. And so tracking down these students who in this remote and hybrid learning environment and being able to even identify, if they have extra learning needs or if they have some sort of social, emotional, or economic thing that they could use some support with, being able to do that was just not available in either environment. Because what the participants that we talked to told us is that students, because opting into coming to the physical school building in the hybrid environment meant that some people just were like, well, I'm not coming at all, and you'll never see me and you'll never hear from me. And so mitigating the opportunity to be able to identify students' needs was just not present, even in the hybrid environment. So again, this participant is talking about how at the end of a class, because we know some students log on and then walk away, teachers would end the class, and then there's 3 or 4 students that are not logging out because they're not in front of the computer. They don't know class is over. They're off playing video games or taking care of a sibling or doing something else. And so being able to build a relationship with a student that you don't see or talk to is pretty impossible. And this was especially true for employees who were new to a school. As a support professional, some of the participants that we talked to said it's really hard to build trust with students, especially if they've never met them. So that was true both for professionals who were new to their school, but also if we're talking about incoming 6th graders or incoming 9th graders or transfer students. They don't know you, you don't know them, and why would they confide in you if they have some sort of need for support, if you're not a trusted adult to them because they've never actually met you face to face or interacted with you. Another thing that we saw is the idea of building relationships, the rapport that happens with students, those are organic things that happen, between bells or at lunchtime or just in the classroom when people are working on different projects and teachers are moving around and talking to them. That's not there. And there's so much that we were asking of teachers during the pandemic, especially of our hybrid teachers who are juggling both students in front of them and students online at the same time, is that there was no mental or physical time left for teachers to build relationships with students. And so this one professional said that I think teachers are working their butts off and we're doing a lot of spinning wheels. And so the participant had just come from a meeting, and there's some students that they've been trying to track down all year, and you're just doing the same things over and over. You're calling, you're texting, you're emailing parents, you're going to the house and nobody's answering, and it's just it's like being Sisyphus rolling that ball up the hill, and then at the end of the day it rolls back down to the bottom. So one of our participants talked explicitly about the fact that when you're in a hybrid classroom and you've got students online and students in person on the same at the same time, and it's like teachers were repeating themselves, they're being asked the same questions over and over because sometimes the microphones aren't necessarily picking up what's happening in one environment for the other. And so teachers, as we've seen in the news and just in Bureau of Labor Statistics stats for the last couple of years, teachers are leaving the profession in droves because this was so hard and so demanding on them that it's no longer felt like it was worthwhile for them. And also what we saw is with students having these increased needs, their mental health, their parents are losing their jobs, they have physical health concerns, either for themselves or for someone that they live with. Teachers have so many more things that they needed to be able to identify because and support for the students that they had in their classroom, and the number of students who are failing. And if we just sat down and tried to make a list of all of the extra responsibilities and stress that were added to teachers during the pandemic, I mean, we would need way more than the 19 minutes we have left in this presentation, and probably then some. So there was no space for teachers to build that informal rapport and that trust that often facilitates a positive school climate and positive student outcomes. So just to sort of summarize with the social components of school climate, what we saw is there was a lot of concerns about isolation, not being able to interact, and then social media not being helpful in helping students' mental health. One thing we observed, and I can't say whether this is true everywhere, but schools that were fully remote offered virtual clubs, and some of the participants told us they were very well attended. Hybrid schools, what we saw is that they didn't offer these because, again, it's that they didn't offer clubs or activities because it was too hard to navigate who's going to be in person, who's going to be remote. Can we have these students that are in isolated classrooms all day be in the same place together? And so a lot of them, just for the sake of simplicity, said no clubs, which is very hard. And then for the relationships between students and professionals, we saw there was a lot of difficulty connecting with students. There were extra challenges for professionals new to school and also for those students who are new to school, because you don't have your trusted adult, you don't have your favorite teacher or the guidance counselor that you've been with for 4 years. You don't have that person anymore if you don't know them. And so there was not a lot of time with all the extra demands for relationship building with students. The next set of findings that I'm going to talk about is the emotional components of school climate. And so this was overwhelmingly, for I think the mood of the entire nation and perhaps the entire world, this was not a great time, and this was a really difficult time to be a student or a professional. And so well-being and self-efficacy went way, way down for both professionals and students during this time, regardless of whether they were in a remote or hybrid learning environment. Mental health, feeling overwhelmed, feeling stressed, anxious, depressed, this was common among school professionals and among students. And students often had extra responsibilities at home, such as caring for younger siblings, and there was just so much more for school professionals to deal with in the school day and outside of the school day, because we know teachers very rarely are done when the final bell rings, with doing this all remote or hybrid compared to when you're just fully in person with students. And then for self-efficacy and motivation, students had very little motivation generally. So there were, participants told us, there were those high-flying students who are super motivated or who have parents who are super involved. And on top of them, they did seemingly okay in the pandemic relative to their peers, but there were a lot of students who lost a lot of motivation to do their work, especially when testing requirements became more lax. It's very hard to explain to a student that just because you don't have to do testing and pass testing in this particular year doesn't mean you're not going to be accountable for learning the information that for subsequent school years it's going to build on those concepts and you're going to be tested on those future concepts. And then participants talked a lot. They had tremendous admiration for what teachers were doing during the pandemic and just how much teachers struggled to manage students' motivation, their decreased academic performance, the absenteeism. And so what participants kind of told us is teachers are trying really, really hard to pull, water from a stone. They're putting in so much effort and producing so little results. And so it was very frustrating. Another thing that we saw is because for students who were struggling in the hybrid environment, they typically did not come to school. And for fully remote students, it was very hard for school support professionals to carry out the mental health interventions that they typically provide for students because there were a lot of limitations about what you could or could not talk about with students when you were meeting with them via Zoom. And there was a lot of consenting and there was a lot of information that would change very quickly. So we had some participants who said, yes, we're still allowed to do suicide screenings, but we do them remotely. Others that were told, no, you can't do it at all. Some that said, yes, you can do it, no, you can't. And so just a lot of confusion, and school support professionals in particular talked a lot about how they felt like they weren't able to do their jobs effectively because they couldn't carry out their duties in the way that they normally would. And so we didn't see a lot of benefits of being in a hybrid environment versus a remote environment because the struggles by and large seemed to be the same no matter which type of school you were in. So again, just feeling overwhelmed and stressed, students thinking this is never going to come to an end. Because again, if we think about a 10-year-old, 50% of their life has been spent in school, and we take a year and have them not be in school because of the pandemic, that's 20% of their schooling experience is in this weird environment. And it's very hard to conceptualize that things may go back to normal, things will be a little bit different, and things like that. And so then another thing that participants told us is that students who were anxious or depressed at baseline, a lot of their behaviors and their emotions were just heightened even so much more. And so they think that this particular participant that's up on the screen said that students may think they're being super productive, but they're just spinning their wheels and they're not turning in their work, and then they get overwhelmed and they're falling behind. And so being able to intervene on those students in the way that you would typically, like conferencing with them, pulling them into your office if you're a guidance counselor or something like that, you can't do in a remote environment, and you may not get those students may not be identified to you as early as they would have been in a face-to-face environment, because the teacher is trying to keep up with so many other things that they don't necessarily notice that the student who is typically an A or B student has a bunch of missing work. And then another participant said that we as a society, parents, educators, etc., should have adjusted our expectations of students and adjusted it down a little bit during the pandemic, been a little bit more cognizant of just how much of an emotional toll experiencing the pandemic as a young person would have been. And I think sometimes we're seeing some of those behaviors in students today in school that are lingering from having gone through the pandemic and just not being supported in a way that was useful during that time, which is not, I'm not putting blame on anyone for that, because obviously we were in unprecedented times. There wasn't a lot of guidance, but I think moving forward, it would be really great to see if in the event that we encounter another pandemic, that we're a little bit more cognizant of students' well-being and can come up with some more effective strategies for helping them. And then getting students to understand that school is your job, and then suddenly you don't have to go to your job because it's online. And like, I think what this participant is talking about is there was not a lot of motivation. Students were not sometimes keeping up with their work in the way that they should be. And I think we're still kind of dealing with the effects of that behavior today. And yeah, so this participant put it very simply: if you're a student, you fall asleep in school, your teacher's going to come down and tap you and wake you up, and maybe, send you get like a a snack or something like that. But if your camera's off, your microphone's off, and you're sitting there and you fall asleep, who's checking on you, if anyone? And then there was, again, of course, with everyone during the pandemic, there was fears of COVID-19, and it's, this highly transmissible, potentially deadly virus. It's a source of stress for students and for teachers. And what we see a lot now, and I think this is pretty common, especially in some places in Clark County, is when students are being raised by grandparents, elderly adults, and the potential harm that the COVID-19 virus could do to them long term was something that students really cared about and were worried about. And then also, I think this quote down at the bottom just sort of summarizes everything that we know about what happened to school-age children during the pandemic. It's just a magnifying glass on issues that were probably involved in the students' world. And it's I think it's just really heartbreaking when we think about the pandemic just amplified so many of the disparities for children in the US and across the world. Children experiencing poverty experience greater poverty without access to lunches or meals at school. Students with mental health needs may not have gotten their mental health needs met, things like that. Teachers, again, super overwhelmed. When we're in hybrid, they're trying to figure out how to teach effectively and keep the kids engaged, but trying to reach out to those kids that aren't showing up online. It's super messy. And so this other participant talked about how being physically in the school building is a bit of an equalizer that's not available when students are not physically present in the building. So making sure that you have reliable internet access. I know there were hotspots and different opportunities available for students, but even thinking about having to leave your home to access a hotspot to get online to go to school versus someone who can, pull up an iPad or a laptop from their bed. And that person maybe has a warm breakfast and the student who's going to the hotspot doesn't. Just all of those different privileges. And so teachers and educators, and I think the world in general, what this participant says is that students that have different privileges, you can't treat every kid the same. And so this idea of equity, meeting students where they are, hopefully will be something that we carry forward from the experience of the pandemic. Running a little short on time. So, again, teachers were trying super hard and not getting a lot of results, which is very frustrating and demoralizing. Especially, we know educators have so much heart and passion for their children. And it's hard when you don't see that come to life. This other quote is really great. So a participant was like, this is not online education, it's disaster education. And we're just not going to be able to reap the same rewards that we would in a standard year. And I think that that's true. We're now almost 5 years removed from the global shutdown, and we're still seeing the lingering effects of what this pandemic did for education. And then again, something that would be considered confidential, participants weren't necessarily allowed to broach that because, again, there's that risk of who's in the room with the student who's talking to you on Zoom. If they disclose to you something about abuse that's happening in their home and the person who is the abuser overhears, like, what sort of risk are you putting those children in? And so there's not really like a good answer about what to do. But I think just the awareness is super important. So again, we saw very few differences between remote and hybrid environments in terms of hybrid environments being able to mitigate some of the emotional difficulties that happened during the pandemic. And so just to wrap up, the purpose of this study was just to sort of add to the playbook of factors that that educational leaders and policymakers should consider. So I would say they can be used in tandem with research on student achievement and public health infrastructure. They should not supersede either of those to guide information. Overall, what we saw is there wasn't really a ton of difference between hybrid and remote environments. That's not to say that one is superior to the other. It's just something to keep in mind that some of the advantages that having a hybrid environment may have presented on paper did not necessarily come to fruition according to the participants in our study. And so this is just another summary of that. And so again, just to emphasize, like, this research is meant to be used as like a complement to public health guidance and educational achievement guidance. And we're talking about a small sample of obviously what we believe to be extremely qualified experts. But they can only really tell us about what they saw and observed. And so that's just something to keep in mind about the type of research that we conducted. So now I will open it up to questions. If there's any questions from the audience, we have about 5 minutes. And I have just one more slide after this with information about the next scholarship and practice series. So questions? I'm just gonna double check the chat. I don't see any. If you have any questions about this is my email address and phone number. I would just like to thank you for taking an hour out of your day to join me to talk about this topic. I know that talking about the pandemic is not always the most fun, and can sometimes be a little bit triggering for people. And so I just appreciate your time and attention and consideration about what we can do in the future to support kids if we encounter something like this again. And then lastly, the next Scholarship and Practice lecture series will take place on February 10th from 4 to 5 p.m. It's going to be presented by two fabulous College of Education colleagues, Cassidy O'Connell and Chloe Stediford. And they're going to be talking about comprehensive transition programs for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So anybody that works with SPED populations, I think this would be a really great opportunity for you to learn a little bit more about that. So, okay, I think that's all I've got, but we would just appreciate your time, and please feel free to reach out if you have any questions.